On a quiet Sunday morning inside St. Matthew's Church in Boston, Kyle Mercer ended his marriage in front of witnesses. He did it calmly. "Take the kids and leave," he told Fiona Caldwell loud enough for the pews behind them to hear. "This family is over." Two small hands clung to Fiona's coat. Noah and Lily, too young to understand why their father was already standing beside another woman, Vanessa Blake. A ring glimmered in her hand. When Kyle motioned for security to escort Fiona out, a gray-haired man in the last row slowly lifted his gaze. Kyle never noticed him. If he had, he might have realized the man he had just humiliated owned the company that made Kyle Mercer powerful. Before this story begins, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel far, and it's always meaningful to see how many places truth can reach. And if you believe that dignity, patience, and quiet strength still matter in this world, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest of what happened after that morning. Fiona Caldwell had always been a quiet observer of the world. Not the kind of quiet that came from fear, nor the kind that meant she had nothing to say. Hers was a deliberate, quiet, measured, patient, and attentive. The kind of silence that noticed small changes long before anyone else did. It was a habit she had carried since childhood. Her father used to say that the loudest truths in life rarely arrived with noise. They appeared in small details, things most people were too distracted to see. Fiona believed that, and over the years she learned to write those details down. The small notebook she kept rarely left her side. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secretive. Most people who noticed it assumed it was a planner. In a way, it was. Inside were dates, small observations, reminders, and fragments of ordinary life. But sometimes without even realizing it, Fiona was recording something else. Patterns. Their home sat on a quiet street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A modest but comfortable house with white siding, a maple tree in the front yard, and a porch where the twins liked to sit with their coloring books. Every weekday morning began almost the same way. At 6:45 a.m., Fiona would be in the kitchen making oatmeal while the coffee brewed. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the house as the twins wandered in, still half asleep. Noah Mercer always arrived first. He had inherited his father's habit of waking early, though his personality was softer. He often sat silently at the table while Fiona placed a bowl in front of him. Lily Mercer followed a few minutes later. Lily had energy, Noah didn't. She asked questions before breakfast was even served. Questions about school, about clouds, about whether squirrels ever got lost. Fiona always answered, patiently, carefully, sometimes with a smile that suggested she was still half thinking about something else. On the mornings when Kyle Mercer was home, he usually appeared around 7. Kyle had built a reputation for discipline. Even as a teenager, he had been competitive, focused, and relentless about goals. Those traits served him well. At 34, Kyle was already a senior executive at Northgate Dynamics, a rapidly growing logistics and infrastructure company with offices across several states. His colleagues often described him as driven, ambitious, sharp. Fiona had once admired those qualities. In the early years of their marriage, Kyle's determination felt like momentum, like the engine pulling the entire family forward. Back then, he still lingered at the breakfast table. Back then, he laughed when Lily asked him if CEOs ever had to do homework. Back then, he carried Noah on his shoulders to the car. But momentum can change direction without warning, and Fiona had started noticing the shift months ago. Not through arguments, not through dramatic confrontations, just small things. The first change was time. Kyle began arriving home later than usual. At first, it was easy to explain. Northgate Dynamics had been expanding quickly, and Kyle often spoke about new contracts, board pressure, and the expectations placed on leadership. Late meetings were normal. Business dinners happened. But Fiona noticed the timing carefully. She wrote it down one evening while the twins were finishing their homework. March 12th. Kyle home at 10:45 p.m., said client dinner. A week later, March 19th home at 11:20 p.m., same explanation. Then March 26th, 12:10 a.m. She didn't confront him, not yet. The second change was his phone. Kyle had never been careless with technology, but he had never been secretive either. That changed quietly. One evening, while Fiona was clearing the dinner table, Kyle's phone lit up on the counter. A name appeared. Vanessa. No last name. The message preview disappeared before Fiona could read it. Kyle returned to the kitchen moments later and picked up the phone without comment. "Work," he said casually. Fiona nodded. She didn't ask more. But later that night, after the house fell quiet and the twins were asleep, she opened her notebook. April 2nd message from Vanessa at 8:43 p.m. She didn't know who Vanessa was yet, but she wrote the name anyway. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued to shift. Kyle traveled more frequently. Boston, New York, Chicago. Sometimes he mentioned conferences, sometimes strategy meetings. Sometimes he simply said, the company needed him. Fiona listened. She asked practical questions, flight time schedules, whether he would be home before the twins' weekend soccer games. Kyle's answers grew shorter, more distracted, and sometimes slightly impatient. "You worry too much," he told her once while buttoning his shirt before work. "I'm not worried," Fiona said calmly. She meant it. Worry implied panic. What she felt instead was something quieter. Observation. One Saturday afternoon in late spring, Fiona was folding laundry in the living room when the twins burst inside after playing in the yard. Lily carried a dandelion crown she had made herself. "Mom," she said breathlessly, "do flowers know when they're dying?" The question caught Fiona slightly off guard. "Why do you ask?" she said gently. Lily shrugged. "They look fine until they don't." Fiona looked down at the small crown in her daughter's hands. For a moment she thought about the notebook upstairs, about the dates, about the name Vanessa. Then she smiled. "I think flowers just change," she said, sometimes slowly. That same evening, Kyle returned home, earlier than usual. He walked through the front door with the brisk confidence he often carried after a successful week. The twins ran toward him. Noah asked about a science project. Lily showed him the dandelion crown. Kyle smiled and patted their heads. But Fiona noticed something subtle. His attention drifted quickly. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Kyle glanced down. A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he silenced it. During dinner, he spoke about the company. Northgate Dynamics had secured a major new logistics contract. It would mean expansion, more responsibility, possibly a promotion. "Things are changing fast," Kyle said. There was pride in his voice. Fiona nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "They are." Kyle didn't notice the second meaning. Most people wouldn't have. But the narrator knew something Fiona did not yet fully understand. Kyle Mercer believed he was moving forward into a better life. He believed he was building something new. He believed the decisions he was beginning to make would bring him freedom. What he didn't realize was that every late night, every message, every unexplained expense was quietly assembling a record, not created by lawyers, not by investigators, but by the calm woman sitting across from him at the dinner table. Fiona Caldwell didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't even interrupt. She simply listened. And later that night, when the house fell quiet again, she opened the notebook. Another date, another line, another piece of a story that had not yet revealed its ending. Harold Caldwell preferred to move through the world quietly. Those who met him for the first time often described him in simple terms: polite, reserved, perhaps even a little old-fashioned. He lived in a historic townhouse on Beacon Hill in Boston where narrow brick sidewalks and gas lamps made the streets feel older than the rest of the city. His neighbors knew him as a man who walked every morning at 7. He wore the same charcoal coat in winter and carried the same leather briefcase, even when he wasn't going anywhere that required paperwork. Some believed he was retired. Others assumed he managed a few investments. Few people asked further questions. Harold rarely offered answers. What people noticed instead was his consistency. Every Sunday afternoon, without exception, Fiona Caldwell arrived with the twins. Noah and Lily treated the Beacon Hill townhouse like a second home. The staircase was narrow but familiar to them, and the living room window overlooked a quiet street where Lily liked to count passing dogs. Harold always greeted them at the door himself. Grandpa, Lily would say, running straight into his arms. Noah was more reserved, though he followed closely behind with a shy smile. Harold knelt to their level every time. He asked about school, about books they were reading, about whatever curiosity had captured Lily's attention that week. Only after the twins ran upstairs toward the toy room did he turn his attention fully to Fiona. He studied her in the careful way fathers sometimes do. Not intrusive, just observant. That afternoon, Fiona stood by the dining table, removing her coat slowly. "Tea?" Harold asked. She nodded. The two of them sat across from each other as the kettle finished heating. From upstairs came the muffled sound of laughter. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They rarely rushed conversation. Harold poured the tea with steady hands. "You look tired," he said at last. Fiona offered a faint smile. "It's been a busy few weeks." Harold didn't immediately ask why. He had learned long ago that Fiona preferred to reach difficult subjects on her own terms. Instead, he waited. Fiona's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the teacup. "I think Kyle is traveling more than he tells us," she said. The words came calmly, not with anger, just clarity. Harold nodded once. "Work pressure?" he asked. "That's what he says." "And what do you think?" Fiona didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the staircase where the twins were playing. Then she said quietly, "I think there's someone else." Harold didn't react with surprise, not because he already knew, but because he understood human nature well enough to recognize when a pattern had begun to shift. "Do you have proof?" he asked gently. Fiona shook her head. "Not proof," she said. "Just pieces." She didn't elaborate. But Harold knew Fiona well enough to imagine what that meant. Pieces were rarely random in Fiona's world. They were usually arranged, documented, recorded. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. Sometimes, he said slowly, people reveal themselves long before they realize anyone is watching. Fiona looked at him thoughtfully. "You're not surprised," she said. Harold's expression remained calm. "I've spent my life observing people who believe success protects them from consequences," he replied. "Eventually, it doesn't." Fiona lowered her eyes to the table. "What should I do?" she asked. The question was not desperate. It was practical. Harold considered his answer carefully. "Nothing," he said. Fiona looked up. "Nothing." "For now," Harold clarified. "Watch, listen, and keep your notes." Fiona didn't ask how he knew about the notebook. Harold had always noticed things like that. Across the Charles River inside the glass-walled headquarters of Northgate Dynamics, Kyle Mercer was having a very different kind of afternoon. The conference room overlooked Boston Harbor, and sunlight reflected off the water as executives reviewed quarterly projections. Kyle stood near the presentation screen, speaking confidently about expansion. "Northgate's logistics platform is positioned to dominate the East Coast market within the next 3 years, he said. Several board members nodded. Kyle had built a reputation for aggressive strategy and decisive leadership. At 34, he was already considered one of the company's most promising executives. What few people realized was how quickly his confidence had grown in recent months. Success has a way of doing that, especially when it arrives early. Kyle believed he understood the company. He believed he understood its leadership structure. He believed he understood the invisible hierarchy that determined who held real power. What he didn't know was that the quiet man drinking tea in Beacon Hill had shaped much of that hierarchy decades earlier. Northgate Dynamics had begun as a small infrastructure consulting firm. At the time, Harold Caldwell had been its founder. But over the years, he had gradually stepped away from public leadership. Shares had been reorganized, trusts established, ownership dispersed through carefully structured holdings. To the outside world, Northgate appeared to be run by a collection of corporate investors. Only a handful of people knew that Harold Caldwell remained the company's controlling shareholder through a private trust, and Kyle Mercer was not one of them. Harold had chosen not to tell him. Not when Kyle married Fiona. Not when Kyle received his first promotion. Not even when Kyle moved steadily up the executive ladder. Harold believed in allowing people to reveal their character naturally. Power, he often said, had a way of exposing what ambition tried to hide. Back in Beacon Hill, Fiona helped Lily build a puzzle on the living room floor. Noah sat nearby reading a book about space exploration. Harold watched them quietly from his armchair. After a while, Fiona's phone buzzed softly on the table. A message. Kyle. She glanced at the screen. Working late again. Don't wait up. The message was short, routine. Fiona typed a simple reply. Okay, drive safe. She placed the phone back down without expression. Harold noticed. Another late meeting, he asked. Yes. Fiona stood and walked toward the window. Outside, evening shadows had begun to stretch across the street. Dad, she said quietly. Yes. If things become difficult. Harold didn't let her finish. You and the children will never be without support, he said firmly. Fiona nodded. She had never doubted that. But she also knew something else about her father. Harold Caldwell rarely intervened unless absolutely necessary. He believed people deserved the chance to show exactly who they were, even when the truth might be painful. Upstairs, the twins' laughter echoed again. Fiona looked toward the sound. Then she returned to the table, opened her bag, and took out the small notebook. She wrote a single new entry, May 3rd. Kyle working late again. The narrator already understood something Fiona had not yet fully accepted. The story unfolding around her was moving toward a moment when silence would no longer be possible. But for now, the pieces were still being placed. Carefully, quietly, and somewhere across the city a man who believed he controlled his future had no idea how close he was to stepping into a truth far larger than himself. Vanessa Blake understood something about ambition that many people preferred not to admit. In most companies, talent was only part of the equation. Intelligence mattered, hard work mattered, but influence, who trusted you, who noticed you, who stood beside you in a room full of decision-makers often mattered more. Vanessa had learned that lesson early. At 31, she had already moved through 3 marketing departments in 4 years, each time leaving with a slightly better title and a slightly higher salary. She had a way of reading rooms quickly, understanding who held real power and who only appeared to. That instinct was what brought her to Northgate Dynamics, and eventually to Kyle Mercer. The first time they met had been ordinary, a quarterly strategy meeting. Kyle had been presenting a plan for expanding Northgate's logistics services into several new markets. Vanessa had joined the company only 2 weeks earlier as Director of Marketing Strategy. From the moment Kyle began speaking, Vanessa recognized something useful. He was confident, not the quiet confidence of someone secure in their position, but the sharper kind, the type that liked being admired. After the meeting ended, She approached him near the coffee station. "That was an impressive projection model," she said. Kyle looked up from his phone, slightly surprised. "Thank you," he replied. "Most executives don't understand marketing data well enough to integrate it into operations strategy," Vanessa added. "You did. Compliments, when delivered carefully, had a way of opening doors." Kyle smiled. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but something had already begun. Weeks passed. At first, their interactions remained professional. Vanessa requested meetings to align marketing campaigns with Kyle's expansion plans. They exchanged emails about logistics forecasts, branding strategies, and conference appearances. But gradually, the tone shifted. Work conversations stretched beyond scheduled meetings. Emails turned into late-evening text messages, and, eventually, dinners. Officially, they were strategy discussions. Unofficially, they became something else. Kyle told himself the situation was complicated. His marriage had grown distant. Fiona seemed withdrawn lately, he thought. She asked fewer questions. She watched more than she spoke. Kyle interpreted her silence as disinterest. Vanessa, on the other hand, appeared energized by everything he said. She admired his leadership. She encouraged his ideas. She spoke about the future, as if Kyle Mercer was destined to lead it. For a man whose career had always been defined by competition, that admiration felt intoxicating. One evening in late May, Kyle and Vanessa sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor. The city lights reflected off the water as the dinner crowd thinned. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You're not like the other executives here," she said. Kyle raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Most of them inherited their positions," she replied. "Or they spent 20 years climbing internal ladders. And me. You move fast." Kyle smiled slightly. "I like results." Vanessa tilted her head thoughtfully. "You're going to run this company someday," she said. The statement was delivered casually, but it lingered in the air between them. Kyle didn't argue. Inside, he had begun to believe something similar. Northgate Dynamics was expanding quickly, and the current CEO had hinted more than once about future leadership changes. Kyle imagined himself stepping into that role. He imagined the authority, the recognition, the freedom, and increasingly, he imagined that future without Fiona. Across the river in Cambridge, Fiona Caldwell sat at the kitchen table while the twins worked on their homework. Noah carefully drew a diagram of the solar system for a school project, lily-colored stars around the edges of her worksheet. Fiona helped when they asked questions, but part of her attention drifted elsewhere. The clock on the wall read 9:35 p.m. Kyle had texted earlier that evening. Late meeting. It was the same explanation he had used several times that month. Fiona didn't challenge it. Instead, after the twins went to bed, she opened her laptop and began organizing the notes she had collected over the past few weeks. Dates, times, receipts. Nothing dramatic. But patterns were becoming clearer. Several of Kyle's late meetings aligned with restaurant charges that appeared on the shared credit card statement. One name appeared more than once. Harborview Grill. Fiona searched the address online. It overlooked the harbor. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she wrote another line in her notebook. May 28th. Harborview charge. Kyle said meeting. She closed the notebook gently. Back at the restaurant, Vanessa finished her wine. "You look distracted," she said. Kyle shook his head. "Just thinking. About the company, about the future." Vanessa studied him carefully. "Does Fiona know you're unhappy?" she asked. Kyle hesitated. "I wouldn't say unhappy," he replied. "Just outgrowing things." Vanessa didn't push further. She didn't need to. Seeds planted carefully often grew on their own. In the weeks that followed, Kyle spent more time outside the house. Business travel increased. Some trips were legitimate, others were convenient. Vanessa began accompanying him on several conferences. Officially, she was representing the marketing department. Unofficially, the two of them often disappeared after the day's meetings ended. Kyle convinced himself he was managing both worlds: work success, a marriage that still functioned on the surface, and something new forming quietly in the background. What he didn't realize was that the surface had already begun to crack. One evening in early June, Fiona was clearing the dinner dishes when Kyle walked through the door. It was earlier than usual. The twins rushed toward him. Noah asked about a science experiment. Lily held up a drawing she had made at school. Kyle smiled briefly, but Fiona noticed the way his attention drifted toward his phone again. A message vibrated against the table. Kyle glanced down quickly. Vanessa. The name appeared clearly this time. He turned the phone face down almost immediately. Fiona said nothing. Instead, she placed the dishes into the sink. "Dinner's still warm," she said. Kyle nodded absently, but the narrator understood something Kyle did not. Vanessa Blake had entered the story quietly, like a shadow appearing slowly across a room. Kyle believed he was making choices that would reshape his future. But those choices were leaving traces, and across the kitchen, the woman who spoke the least was already beginning to see the outline of something much larger than a simple affair. The story had not yet reached its turning point, but the pieces were no longer random. They were moving toward each other, slowly, inevitably. And somewhere within those pieces lay a truth that Kyle Mercer would one day wish he had recognized much sooner. In the early years of their marriage, Kyle Mercer used to come home carrying stories. Stories about difficult negotiations, about contracts that almost collapsed before being saved at the last minute, about the strange politics of boardrooms where everyone smiled while calculating advantage. Fiona Caldwell used to listen while setting plates on the dinner table. Back then, Kyle spoke to her as if she were part of the journey. Lately, he spoke as if the journey belonged only to him. The change did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly into their routine like dust that appeared little by little until it became impossible not to notice. By the beginning of summer, Kyle rarely stayed long at the dinner table. Some evenings he barely touched the food Fiona prepared. His phone often rested beside his plate screen, lighting up every few minutes. He usually flipped it face down. But even a turned phone could not hide everything. Fiona had learned that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. One Thursday evening in June, the twins were excited about something small. Their school year had just ended, and Noah had brought home a certificate for a science project about planetary orbits. Lily had received recognition for a drawing she had submitted to the school art board. They spread their papers across the dining table, while Fiona prepared pasta. Kyle arrived home around 7:30. Earlier than usual, the children ran toward him with their certificates. "Dad," look, Lily said. Kyle glanced down briefly. "That's great," he said. His voice was polite, but distracted. He placed his briefcase on the chair and checked his phone before sitting down. Noah looked slightly confused. "Did you see the planets?" he asked. Kyle nodded without really looking. "Very impressive." Fiona noticed the moment carefully. She didn't comment, but later that night when the house fell quiet again, she opened her notebook. June 12th. Kyle distracted during dinner. The line was simple, but Fiona rarely needed long sentences to capture meaning. A week later, she found the first unmistakable sign. It happened on a Monday morning. The twins had already left for summer camp, and Kyle had rushed out early for work. Fiona was cleaning the kitchen when the home printer suddenly started humming. A document slid out slowly. At first, she assumed it was something Kyle had sent from his office by mistake. That happened occasionally. But when she picked up the paper, she paused. It was a legal document header. A law firm in downtown Boston. The words at the top were simple and unmistakable. Consultation summary. Family law. Fiona read only the first few lines. The meeting had taken place 3 days earlier. The subject discussed was divorce procedure in the state of Massachusetts. For several seconds, she stood perfectly still in the kitchen. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden rush of anger, only a slow exhale. Then Fiona placed the document back on the counter and turned off the printer. She did not read further. Instead, she walked upstairs, retrieved her notebook, and wrote one new entry. June 19th. Kyle met divorce attorney. She closed the notebook carefully. The quiet woman who had spent months observing patterns now understood the direction those patterns were taking. But she still did not confront him. Not yet. That evening, Kyle returned home later than usual. The twins were already asleep. Fiona was sitting in the living room with a book when he walked in. "You're up late," he said. "I was reading," she replied calmly. Kyle loosened his tie and walked toward the kitchen. "Long day," he muttered. Fiona watched him for a moment. Then she spoke. "You met with a lawyer on Friday." Kyle froze. The silence in the room stretched for several seconds. When he turned around, his expression had changed. "How do you know that?" "The printer," Fiona said. Kyle exhaled slowly. For a moment, he seemed to be calculating something. Then he sat down across from her. "Look," he began. "I was going to talk to you about it." Fiona waited. Kyle leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Our marriage hasn't been working for a while," he said. The sentence sounded rehearsed. "I think we both know that." Fiona did not argue. She simply asked one question. "Is there someone else?" Kyle hesitated, just long enough to answer the question without speaking. "Yes," he said finally. Her face remained calm. "How long? A few months." And her name, Kyle, hesitated again. Vanessa. The name Fiona had written weeks earlier now settled into certainty. She nodded once. The conversation might have exploded into anger in another household. But Fiona's voice remained steady. "What do you want to happen next?" she asked. Kyle seemed slightly surprised by the question. "I think it would be better if we separated," he said. "Soon." Fiona looked toward the hallway where the twins slept. "They're 8 years old," she said quietly. Kyle shifted in his chair. "They'll adjust." Fiona studied him for a moment. Then she nodded again. "All right," she said. Kyle blinked. "That's it, for tonight," Fiona replied. She placed her book on the table, and turned off the living room lamp. "I'm going to bed." Kyle watched her walk upstairs. He had expected an argument. Tears, something emotional. Instead, the conversation ended with a quiet acknowledgement. What Kyle did not understand was that Fiona's calmness did not mean the situation was simple. It meant she was already thinking several steps ahead. Later that night, after Kyle had fallen asleep, Fiona sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was completely silent. She opened the notebook again. Under the previous entry, she added another line. June 19th. Kyle admitted affair with Vanessa. She paused. Then she wrote one more. Wants separation. Fiona closed the notebook slowly. The narrator already knew what Fiona herself was beginning to realize. The moment Kyle Mercer decided to end his marriage was not the moment this story truly began. It was only the moment when the truth stopped hiding. For Kyle, the decision felt like freedom. For Fiona, it marked the beginning of something else entirely. A process that would move quietly, carefully, and with far more patience than Kyle Mercer had ever imagined possible. The evening Kyle Mercer finally asked Fiona to leave the house did not begin with shouting. It began with a strange kind of calm. Late summer had settled over Cambridge, and the air carried the quiet heaviness that often came before rain. Fiona was helping Noah and Lily pack their backpacks for the next morning's camp. when she heard the front door open. Kyle stepped inside, but he was not alone. Vanessa Blake followed 2 steps behind him. For a moment, the living room went still. Noah looked up from the table. Dad Kyle forced a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Hey, buddy." Lily noticed Vanessa first. "Who's that?" she asked. Vanessa gave a polite nod but did not answer. Kyle cleared his throat. "Kids, why don't you go upstairs for a minute?" Noah hesitated. "We're finishing our camp forms." "Just for a minute," Kyle repeated. Something in his tone made the twins obey. They gathered their papers and walked slowly toward the stairs, glancing back at Fiona as they passed. Fiona gave them a small, reassuring nod. The moment their footsteps disappeared upstairs, the house fell into an uneasy silence. Vanessa remained near the doorway, arms folded loosely. Kyle stood in the middle of the room, as if preparing himself for a speech. Fiona waited. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Kyle took a breath. "I think it's better if we make this official tonight." Fiona did not move. "Official," she repeated. Kyle gestured vaguely toward the house. "This situation has been dragging on," he said. "We already talked about separation." "Yes," Fiona said, "but you said we would discuss arrangements." Kyle's expression hardened slightly. "I have discussed them," he said, "with my lawyer." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the dining table. "Temporary housing arrangements," he continued. "Legal paperwork." Fiona looked down at the folder. She did not touch it. "And why is Vanessa here?" she asked. Vanessa shifted slightly but remained silent. Kyle answered for her. "She's going to be part of my life," he said. Fiona's gaze moved briefly from Kyle to Vanessa, then back again. The narrator understood something important about this moment. Kyle Mercer believed he was demonstrating control. He believed bringing Vanessa into the house would force the situation to move faster. In his mind, it was efficiency. In reality, it was cruelty. Fiona seemed to understand that as well, but she did not react the way Kyle expected. "Where do you want us to go?" she asked calmly. Kyle blinked. "The apartment on Grove Street," he said. "It's already leased for 3 months. You arranged it." "Yes, and the children's school, they can commute for now." Fiona absorbed the information quietly. Vanessa glanced toward Kyle as if expecting something more dramatic, but the room remained still. "Why tonight?" Fiona asked. Kyle hesitated. "Because I think it's time we stopped pretending," he said. The words sounded decisive, but even as he spoke them, he avoided looking toward the staircase. Fiona noticed. She always noticed. "They're upstairs," she said. Kyle's jaw tightened. "I know." Fiona nodded slowly. "Then we should explain this carefully." Kyle shook his head. "There's nothing complicated to explain." Fiona's voice remained even. "They're 8 years old. They'll adjust," Kyle said. It was the same sentence he had used weeks earlier, but hearing it again inside their home carried a heavier weight. Fiona looked at the folder on the table again. Then she opened it. Inside were several documents prepared by Kyle's attorney. Temporary separation terms, housing agreement, preliminary custody suggestions. The paperwork had already been signed by Kyle. Everything had been arranged before tonight. For a long moment, Fiona simply read. Vanessa shifted her weight impatiently near the door. Kyle crossed his arms. Finally, Fiona closed the folder. "I see," she said quietly. Kyle seemed relieved. "I thought you would." Fiona walked toward the staircase. "I'm going to pack a few things for the children," she said. Kyle frowned. "You don't need to take everything tonight, I know, but they will want their things." She paused at the bottom of the stairs, and, "Kyle, yes, you should probably wait outside while I explain it to them." Kyle's expression tightened again. "I can handle that." Fiona met his eyes. "Not tonight," she said gently. For the first time since entering the house, Kyle looked uncertain, but Vanessa stepped forward slightly. "It might be easier if she talks to them first," Vanessa said. Kyle hesitated. Then he nodded once. "Fine." He walked toward the front door. Vanessa followed. The door closed behind them. Upstairs, Noah and Lily sat on the floor of their bedroom, with their camp papers spread out. They looked up when Fiona entered. "Are we in trouble?" Lily asked. "No," Fiona said softly. She knelt beside them. "We're going to stay with Grandpa for a little while." Noah frowned. Why Fiona chose her words carefully. "Because sometimes adults need time to fix things. Is Dad coming?" "Not tonight." Lily looked confused. "Did we do something wrong?" Fiona shook her head immediately. "Never." She pulled them both into a quiet hug. "None of this is because of you." An hour later, Fiona carried 2 small suitcases downstairs. The twins followed quietly behind her. Kyle and Vanessa were waiting outside on the front walkway. The street was dim under the porch light. Kyle watched as Fiona placed the suitcases in the car. "Is that everything?" he asked. "For tonight," she said. Kyle nodded. He reached into his pocket and removed a small envelope. "This contains the keys to the Grove Street apartment," he said. Fiona accepted the envelope. Then she looked at the house behind him. The porch, the windows, the place where her children had grown up. "You're changing the locks tonight, aren't you?" she asked. Kyle did not answer immediately, but his silence was answer enough. Fiona nodded. "All right." She opened the car door for Noah and Lily. Before getting inside, she turned once more toward Kyle. There was no anger in her face, no accusation, just a quiet finality. "Good night, Kyle," she said. The car pulled away slowly from the curb. Kyle watched the taillights disappear down the street. Vanessa slipped her arm through his. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Kyle nodded. He believed that. But the narrator already understood something Kyle did not. The moment he closed the door on Fiona Caldwell and his 2 children was the moment the story truly began to move. Because across the city, a quiet house in Beacon Hill still had its lights on, and Harold Caldwell was waiting. The townhouse on Beacon Hill was still awake when Fiona Caldwell's car turned onto the narrow street. It was close to midnight. Boston had grown quiet in the way large cities sometimes do after the last restaurants close and the traffic fades into distant echoes. The street lamps cast soft amber circles on the brick sidewalks, and the old buildings seemed to lean toward each other like silent witnesses. Fiona parked along the curb. For a moment she remained still behind the steering wheel. In the back seat, Noah and Lily had both fallen asleep. Their heads rested against opposite windows, small faces softened by exhaustion and confusion. They were too young to fully explain. Fiona watched them for several seconds before stepping out of the car. She walked to the back door first. Noah stirred slightly as she unbuckled his seatbelt. "Are we at Grandpa's?" he murmured. "Yes," Fiona said softly. He nodded, still half asleep. Inside the townhouse, a light turned on, before Fiona even reached the door. Harold Caldwell had been waiting. He opened the door without surprise. His eyes moved quickly over Fiona, then toward the children behind her. "You're late," he said gently. "Traffic," Fiona replied. Harold stepped aside. "Come in." No further questions were asked. Not yet. The twins were carried upstairs first. Lily woke briefly when Fiona placed her under the blankets. "Mom," she whispered. "Yes. Are we staying here long?" Fiona brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "For a little while." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. Within seconds, she was asleep again. Noah asked fewer questions. He simply nodded when Fiona told him the same thing. Children, the narrator understood, often sensed more than adults believed. but exhaustion had claimed them before curiosity could grow stronger. When Fiona returned downstairs, Harold was standing near the kitchen window. He had already poured 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Fiona without speaking. The two of them sat across from each other at the small wooden table. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Harold asked the question he already knew the answer to. "He asked you to leave." Fiona nodded. "Tonight." Harold absorbed the information quietly. "And the children? They're asleep upstairs." Harold leaned back slightly. "Was she there?" Fiona looked down at the tea. "Yes." He nodded once. "What did Kyle say?" Fiona's voice remained calm. "That the situation needed to become official." Harold's expression did not change. "And how did you respond?" "I packed the children's things." Harold watched his daughter carefully. He had seen Fiona face difficulty before. But there was something different about the stillness in her voice tonight. It was not shock. It was not grief. It was clarity. "Do you want to fight him?" Harold asked quietly. Fiona took a slow breath. "I want stability for Noah and Lily," she said. "That's all." Harold nodded. "That's the right place to begin." The following morning arrived with sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the Beacon Hill townhouse. For the twins, the change of location felt almost like a small adventure. Lily discovered that her grandfather kept an entire shelf of puzzle books in the living room. Noah spent the morning examining an old telescope Harold had stored near the window. Children had a remarkable ability to adapt to temporary uncertainty, but Fiona knew adaptation was not the same as resolution. After breakfast, Harold set down his newspaper. "I assume Kyle believes this will be simple," he said. Fiona looked up. "He seems to." Harold nodded slowly. People often confuse confidence with preparation. Fiona reached into her bag and removed the small notebook she had carried for months. She placed it on the table. Harold raised an eyebrow. "May I?" Fiona nodded. He opened the notebook carefully. Inside were pages filled with dates, short observations, locations, expenses. Nothing dramatic. But together they formed a quiet timeline. Harold turned several pages. Phone messages, late nights, restaurant charges. He closed the notebook again. "You've been documenting this for a while." "I didn't realize why at first," Fiona said. But the pattern kept growing. Harold nodded approvingly. "Patterns matter." He placed the notebook back on the table. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" "Not yet." Harold stood up and walked toward the study. "Then you should." An hour later, Fiona sat in the study while Harold made a phone call. His voice carried a calm authority. "Daniel, it's Harold Caldwell." Pause. "Yes, it's been some time." Another pause. "I'd like you to meet my daughter today, if possible." More silence. "Good. 3 o'clock. He ended the call. Fiona looked at him. "Daniel Brooks?" she asked. Harold nodded. "You know him?" "Only by reputation." Daniel Brooks was one of Boston's most respected family law attorneys. He had handled complex divorce cases for executives, politicians, and investors across the state. Harold returned to the table. "You'll meet him this afternoon," he said. Fiona nodded slowly. There was still no anger in her voice, just movement, preparation. The narrator understood something important about this stage of the story. While Kyle Mercer believed he had already taken control of the future, another process had begun quietly on the other side of the city. A slower process, but one far more methodical. Later that afternoon, Fiona sat across from Daniel Brooks in a modest law office overlooking downtown Boston. Daniel was in his early 50s with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades listening to complicated stories. He reviewed the notebook Fiona had brought with her. "You wrote all of this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." Daniel flipped through several pages. "This is remarkably organized." Fiona waited. Daniel looked up. Most clients arrive here with emotions, he said. You arrived with a timeline. Fiona considered the statement quietly. Will it help? She asked. Daniel leaned back slightly. Yes, very much. He closed the notebook. But documentation is only the beginning, he continued. We'll also need financial records, emails, bank statements. Fiona nodded. I can collect those. Daniel studied her carefully. You're not angry, he said. Fiona's expression remained neutral. Anger doesn't solve legal problems. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Outside the office window, Boston traffic moved steadily through the late afternoon light. Somewhere across the city, Kyle Mercer was likely still convinced that the hardest part of his decision had already passed. But the narrator understood otherwise. The quiet woman who had left the house the night before had not disappeared from the story. She had simply stepped into a different role, one that required patience, precision, and time. And time, more than anything else, had a way of revealing exactly who had prepared for the truth and who had not. By the beginning of September, Kyle Mercer had grown accustomed to his new routine. The house in Cambridge no longer felt like a place he needed to return to. Vanessa Blake had moved into the space quickly, confidently rearranging small details of the home as if she had always belonged there. The framed photographs of family vacations had disappeared from the living room shelves. The twins' drawings that once hung on the refrigerator were gone. In their place were new decorations, sleek glass vases, modern artwork Vanessa had chosen, and a collection of wine bottles displayed along the kitchen counter. Kyle barely noticed the changes. To him, the house simply felt quieter, more efficient. Vanessa often said that the past had a way of cluttering the future. Kyle had begun to believe her. At Northgate Dynamics, rumors spread quickly. Corporate offices were environments where personal developments rarely stayed private for long. Within weeks, several executives had noticed that Vanessa Blake and Kyle Mercer arrived at company functions together. At first, colleagues treated the situation cautiously. Divorce proceedings were common among executives. Long hours and high pressure had ended many marriages before. But the speed of Kyle's transition raised eyebrows. One afternoon in the executive lounge, two department managers spoke quietly near the coffee machine. Is it official yet? One of them asked. I heard the paperwork was filed last month, the other replied. And Vanessa? The second manager shrugged. They're not exactly hiding it. Kyle, meanwhile, paid little attention to office gossip. He believed his professional reputation protected him. Performance mattered more than appearances, and by every measurable standard, his performance remained strong. Northgate Dynamics had secured 2 new regional logistics contracts under his leadership that summer. The board had taken notice. During one strategy meeting, the CEO even congratulated him publicly. Kyle's expansion plan has positioned us ahead of our competitors, the CEO said. Several board members nodded. Kyle accepted the praise with calm confidence. Across the table, Vanessa smiled. She had chosen her place carefully. That evening, the two of them attended a corporate networking event at a hotel overlooking Boston Harbor. The ballroom was filled with executives, investors, and city officials. Vanessa moved easily through the crowd. She introduced Kyle to marketing partners, regional consultants, and several potential investors. Each conversation strengthened the image she wanted others to see. A successful executive, a rising company, and a partnership that looked both ambitious and inevitable. At one point, Vanessa leaned closer to Kyle while watching the room. You see, she said softly, this is where you belong. Kyle followed her gaze. Influential people, strategic conversations, opportunities. Yes, he said, it is. Vanessa studied him carefully. Have you told them yet? Told them that you're planning to move forward with the divorce completely? Kyle hesitated. "It's in process." Vanessa's voice remained smooth. "You should make it clear soon. Why? Because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable," she said. "And people respect decisiveness." Kyle considered the advice. Vanessa had a way of framing things in terms that appealed to his sense of leadership. "Yes," he said after a moment. "You're probably right." Across the city, Fiona Caldwell sat in Daniel Brooks' office, reviewing several folders spread across the conference table. Daniel had spent the past few weeks requesting financial documents through formal legal channels. Bank records, corporate expense statements, credit card transactions. What began as a quiet suspicion had now turned into something far more structured. Daniel slid one document toward Fiona. "This is from the shared credit account," he explained. Fiona studied the statement. Several restaurant charges appeared: Harborview Grill, Mariner's Table, the Atlantic Room. Daniel pointed to the dates. "Notice the pattern." Fiona compared the dates with the entries in her notebook. They matched. "Exactly. These are the nights he told me he had meetings," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "And the amounts are significant." He turned another page. This charge was for a weekend hotel stay. Fiona's eyes moved slowly across the paper. "What does this mean, legally?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands. "It establishes financial misconduct during the marriage, especially if company funds were involved." Fiona looked up. "Company funds?" Daniel nodded toward another folder. "We're still verifying," he said. "But several of these transactions appear to have been reimbursed through corporate expense reports." Fiona understood immediately. Kyle had not only used marital money, he might have used company money. Daniel closed the folder carefully. "If that's confirmed," he continued, "the situation becomes more complicated for him." Fiona did not smile. She did not react at all. She simply absorbed the information. Later that evening, Fiona returned to Beacon Hill. Noah and Lily were sitting on the living room floor, working on a puzzle Harold had brought home for them. The twins had adapted surprisingly well to their new routine. Harold walked them to school each morning. Fiona picked them up in the afternoon. The stability helped. Still, small questions appeared sometimes. "Are we going back home soon?" Lily asked one evening. Fiona knelt beside her. "We're safe here," she said gently. Lily nodded. Children often accepted reassurance more easily than explanations. That same night, across the Charles River, Kyle sat beside Vanessa on the balcony of the Cambridge house. The city lights reflected faintly in the distance. Vanessa handed him a glass of wine. "You've been quiet," she said. Kyle leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking about the company, about the future." Vanessa smiled slightly. "I like the sound of that." Kyle looked toward the skyline. "I think we should stop waiting," he said. Vanessa tilted her head. "Waiting for what? The divorce process." Vanessa remained silent. Kyle turned toward her. "I want to move forward." "What do you mean?" Kyle reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. He opened it. Inside was a diamond ring. "Marry me," Kyle said. Vanessa's smile returned instantly. "Yes," she said. They embraced beneath the dim balcony light. For Kyle, the moment felt like the beginning of a new life. But the narrator already understood something Kyle could not yet see. Every decision he believed was moving him closer to success was also bringing him closer to a truth that had been quietly forming for months. And somewhere in a quiet townhouse in Beacon Hill, a father who rarely intervened was beginning to watch the situation with increasing attention. The pieces were still moving, but the shape of the ending had already begun to appear. Kyle Mercer simply had not recognized it yet. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Fiona Caldwell was sitting at the small desk in Harold Caldwell's study, organizing several folders Daniel Brooks had asked her to prepare. The room was calm, filled with soft light from the tall window overlooking Beacon Hill. Legal work had a rhythm Fiona was beginning to understand. Patience, documentation, verification. It was not dramatic work. No one raised their voices, no one rushed, but each small piece of information carried weight. Her laptop chimed softly. A new email notification appeared on the screen. At first, Fiona assumed it was another routine message from Daniel's office, requesting documents. But when she glanced at the sender's name, she paused. Northgate Dynamics, specifically the company's internal accounting department. For a moment, she wondered if the message had been sent by mistake. She had once been listed as an emergency contact for Kyle during the early years of his employment. Perhaps her email address still existed somewhere in the system. The subject line read, "Expense Reimbursement Confirmation. Mercer." Fiona opened the message carefully. Inside was a short confirmation notice. An automated receipt, acknowledging the reimbursement of several business expenses submitted by Kyle Mercer for the previous quarter. Beneath the message was a list of itemized transactions: restaurant meetings, hotel stays, transportation costs. The numbers themselves were not unusual for a corporate executive. But the dates caught Fiona's attention immediately. She reached for her notebook, the same notebook she had carried for months. One by one, she compared the entries. May 28th, June 3rd, June 17th. Each date aligned with nights Kyle had claimed to be working late. Each location matched restaurants she had already documented, but something else stood out now. Several of those expenses had been submitted as official business meetings. Fiona stared at the screen. The implication was simple. Kyle had not only spent personal time with Vanessa Blake, he had reported those evenings as corporate expenses. Later that afternoon, Fiona sat across from Daniel Brooks again. She placed the printed email on the table. Daniel adjusted his glasses and read the document slowly. "This came directly from Northgate's accounting system," he asked. "Yes," Fiona said. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's interesting." He turned the page. "Do you see this column here?" he asked. Fiona nodded. "Client meeting." Daniel tapped the page lightly. "These reimbursements were approved as business expenses." "What does that mean, legally?" Fiona asked. Daniel folded his hands. "It depends on whether the meetings were legitimate." "And if they weren't?" Daniel's voice remained calm. "Then your husband may have submitted false expense reports to his employer." Fiona did not react outwardly, but she understood what Daniel was saying. Misuse of corporate funds was not simply a marital issue. It was a professional one. Daniel looked up at her. "Do you know whether Vanessa Blake attended these dinners?" "Yes," Fiona said quietly. "How certain are you?" Fiona opened her notebook and slid it across the table. Daniel studied the pages. Dates, locations, short descriptions. Restaurant charge Harborview. Same evening, Kyle texted, late meeting. Another entry, June 3rd Atlantic Room dinner. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. "You may have documented something extremely important." Fiona waited. Daniel reached for another folder from his desk. "We'll need additional verification," he said. "Credit card statements, corporate expense reports, possibly internal emails." Fiona nodded. "Can you get them?" Daniel smiled slightly. "That's what legal discovery is for." Across the city, Kyle Mercer was unaware that anything unusual had occurred. His afternoon was filled with meetings. A conference call with the Chicago office, a strategic planning discussion with senior operations staff, and later, a short meeting with Vanessa in her office. She was reviewing marketing proposals when he walked in. "You look busy," Kyle said. Vanessa glanced up. "I always am." She set the documents aside. "How did the board call go?" Kyle loosened his tie. "Good." He leaned against the desk. They're impressed with the new logistics contracts. Vanessa smiled. I told you they would be. Kyle looked out the window toward the harbor. You know what the next step is, he said. Vanessa's eyes brightened slightly. The executive promotion. Kyle nodded. It's only a matter of time. Vanessa stood and walked toward him. And when that happens, she said softly, everything changes. Kyle believed that completely. The narrator, however, knew something Kyle did not. Power in large companies rarely belonged to the person who appeared strongest in the room. Sometimes it belonged to someone who wasn't in the room at all. Back at the law office, Daniel Brooks was already preparing the next step. He turned his computer screen toward Fiona. We'll file a formal discovery request, he explained. That allows us to request financial documentation from both Kyle and Northgate Dynamics. Fiona listened carefully. What happens if the company discovers the expenses weren't legitimate? Daniel's tone remained neutral. Corporate boards take financial misconduct very seriously. Fiona nodded slowly. The situation was growing larger than she had originally expected. Daniel closed the email file. You handled this exactly the right way, he said. Most people would have reacted emotionally when they first discovered the affair. But you documented, you waited, you observed. Fiona looked down at the notebook. I didn't know what I was building, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. You were building a timeline. That evening, Fiona returned to Beacon Hill. Harold Caldwell was sitting in the living room reading when she entered. Long day, he asked. Fiona sat across from him. Yes. Harold watched her quietly. Progress. Fiona handed him a copy of the printed email. Harold read it slowly. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened slightly as he reached the bottom of the page. Corporate reimbursements, he said. Yes. Harold placed the paper on the table. Kyle has always been ambitious, he said thoughtfully. But ambition sometimes encourages people to take shortcuts. Fiona said nothing. Harold leaned back in his chair. This will complicate things for him, he added. The narrator understood something Fiona still had not fully realized. The email was not merely evidence of an affair. It was the first thread, connecting Kyle Mercer's personal choices to something much larger. A company. A board. A structure of authority Kyle believed he understood. But soon, that structure would begin examining him, far more closely than he expected. And when it did, the quiet evidence Fiona had gathered would no longer remain inside a small notebook. It would enter rooms Kyle Mercer had once walked through with absolute confidence. Rooms where decisions were made, and where mistakes, especially expensive ones, rarely stayed hidden for long. The discovery process moved slowly, but never aimlessly. Daniel Brooks had explained it to Fiona Caldwell during their previous meeting. Legal work isn't about speed, he had said. It's about precision. Every document must come from the right place, through the right channel at the right time. Fiona understood that kind of patience. For months, she had been collecting pieces without knowing exactly where they would lead. Now those pieces were being organized into something far more structured. Evidence. 2 weeks after Fiona forwarded the accounting email to Daniel, the first official financial disclosures arrived. The thick envelope from Kyle's legal team appeared ordinary from the outside. But inside were several printed reports that would become far more important than Kyle Mercer had anticipated. Bank statements, credit card histories, expense reimbursement forms. Daniel spread the documents across the conference table in his office. Fiona sat across from him, her notebook beside her. Let's start with the personal accounts, Daniel said. He slid one statement forward. This is the joint credit card you and Kyle shared. Fiona looked down at the list of transactions. Most of them were routine. Groceries, school supplies, utilities, but scattered throughout the statements were charges she had already recognized months earlier. Restaurants, hotels, gifts. Daniel tapped a specific entry. June 3rd, he said. Atlantic Room Restaurant, $284. Fiona flipped through her notebook and found the corresponding line. June 3rd, she read softly. Kyle said he had a client meeting. Daniel nodded, and yet no client name appears here. He pointed to another transaction. June 17th, Harborview Grill. Fiona checked the notebook again. Late meeting, she said quietly. Daniel circled the charge with a pen. So far, the timeline matches your notes perfectly. He moved to the next document. This, he said, is more interesting. The page came from Northgate Dynamics' internal expense reporting system. Kyle had submitted several reimbursement requests during the same time period. Each dinner had been labeled business development. Each receipt had been approved by the company's accounting department. Fiona studied the page. He charged the company for those dinners. Daniel nodded. Yes, and if they weren't business meetings, Daniel leaned back slightly. Then he misrepresented company expenses. Fiona absorbed the information silently. The consequences of that possibility were beginning to take shape. Misusing corporate funds was not just unethical. It was something companies investigated aggressively. Daniel turned another page. There's more. This statement showed a weekend hotel stay in early July. 2 nights. Luxury suite. Room service charges. The total exceeded $1,600. Fiona stared at the date. She knew exactly where Kyle had claimed to be that weekend. Chicago Conference, she said. Daniel checked the location listed on the receipt. Boston Harbor Hotel. The two statements could not both be true. Later that afternoon, Daniel requested another set of records. Corporate reimbursement approvals, he explained. These will show who signed off on the expenses. Fiona nodded. Why does that matter? Because companies track accountability, Daniel said. If someone approved these charges, believing they were legitimate meetings, that's one situation. And if they weren't, then the company may have its own questions. Fiona closed her notebook. Do we contact them? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Discovery comes first. He paused, studying her expression. You're taking this remarkably calmly. Fiona folded her hands. The facts are doing the talking, she said. Daniel smiled slightly. That's usually the strongest position in court. Across the city, Kyle Mercer was preparing for a presentation to Northgate Dynamics' executive board. He stood in the conference room reviewing slides on the large screen. Logistics projections, infrastructure partnerships, expansion forecasts, numbers Kyle understood well. Vanessa Blake sat at the table, reviewing the same documents. You're ready, she said. Kyle nodded confidently. The board likes results. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. They like leadership even more. Kyle glanced at her. You think they'll start discussing promotions soon? Vanessa shrugged lightly. With the way the company is growing, it's inevitable. Kyle allowed himself a small smile. Everything in his life seemed to be aligning exactly as he had planned. His divorce from Fiona was progressing through legal channels. His relationship with Vanessa was public. His career trajectory remained strong. From Kyle's perspective, the most difficult chapter had already passed. The narrator, however, understood something Kyle had not yet noticed. While he was focused on presentations and future promotions, another set of documents was moving quietly through legal systems. Documents that connected personal decisions to financial records. Records that companies often took very seriously. That evening in Beacon Hill, Fiona sat in the living room while Noah and Lily worked on homework. The twins had grown comfortable in their grandfather's house. Noah sat near the window reading a science book. Lily colored pictures at the coffee table. The rhythm of the household had become steady again. Harold Caldwell entered from the kitchen carrying a small tray with tea. Busy day, he asked Fiona. Yes. Harold handed her a cup. Progress. Fiona nodded. Daniel received the bank statements. Harold waited. He also received Kyle's expense reports. Harold's eyebrows lifted slightly, and Fiona placed the documents on the table. He charged the company for dinners with Vanessa. Harold read the pages slowly. The room remained quiet. When he finished, he placed the papers back down carefully. "That's unfortunate," he said. Fiona looked at him. For him. For anyone who confuses personal decisions with corporate responsibility. Harold leaned back in his chair. Companies rarely tolerate that kind of confusion. Fiona understood the implication. Northgate Dynamics was not just Kyle's workplace. It was a corporation with oversight, with policies, with a board that evaluated financial integrity. The narrator already knew something Fiona had not yet been told directly. The board of Northgate Dynamics included a man who had spent decades building the company from the ground up. A man who believed that financial discipline defined leadership. A man who also happened to be Fiona Caldwell's father. For now, Harold remained silent about that role. He simply watched, because the evidence was still gathering, and when the moment arrived to reveal the full truth, it would not require anger or confrontation. Only documentation and patience. Kyle Mercer had built his career on confidence, but confidence often assumed that the structures around it would remain invisible. Soon, those structures would begin looking directly at him, and when they did, the quiet records Fiona had collected would no longer remain personal. They would become something far more serious, something that neither ambition nor confidence could easily dismiss. By mid-October, the legal case had moved into a phase Daniel Brooks described as verification. It was the stage where assumptions became evidence. Fiona Caldwell had already provided her notebook, the financial statements and the email confirmations Daniel requested. The timeline of Kyle Mercer's actions was now documented in several forms: dates, transactions, expense reimbursements. But Daniel had explained something important during their last meeting. In court, he said documents are powerful, but when documentation aligns with direct statements, the truth becomes almost impossible to dispute. Fiona understood what he meant. Words once recorded had a way of revealing intentions that paperwork alone could not, and that was when the audio evidence appeared. It arrived unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, Daniel called Fiona and asked her to come to his office immediately. When she entered the conference room, he was already seated at the table, with a laptop open in front of him. "You need to hear something," he said. Fiona sat down across from him. Daniel turned the laptop slightly toward her. "One of the discovery requests we filed included communications between your husband and Vanessa Blake, related to corporate expense submissions." Fiona nodded, and Daniel clicked on an audio file. This recording was attached to an internal message thread. He paused briefly before pressing play. A quiet conversation filled the room. At first, the voices were faint, but within seconds, Fiona recognized Kyle's voice clearly. "They don't need to know the details," he was saying. Vanessa's voice followed. "Are you sure accounting won't ask questions?" Kyle laughed softly. "They won't. It's easier to file the dinners as client meetings. No one checks those closely." There was a pause. Then Vanessa spoke again. "So the Chicago trip," Kyle interrupted. "That wasn't Chicago." "Exactly," Vanessa said. Another small laugh. "Relax," Kyle replied. "The company reimburses thousands of expenses every quarter. Nobody tracks a few dinners." The recording ended. The room fell quiet again. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. "That file came from Northgate's internal server records," he explained. It was attached to a messaging thread discussing the reimbursement forms. Fiona absorbed the information without visible reaction, but she understood immediately. This was no longer speculation. Kyle had acknowledged the deception in his own voice. Daniel watched her carefully. "You're taking this well." Fiona folded her hands. It confirms what the records already showed. Daniel nodded. Yes, but it does something more important. What it reveals intent. Fiona looked at the laptop again. And that matters. In legal terms, Daniel said intent changes everything. Later that same afternoon, Daniel explained how the recording would be used. First, we verify the source. It came through official discovery, so that step is already satisfied. He opened another document. Next, we connect the recording to the financial timeline. Fiona followed the logic. The dinners, she said. Yes, and the hotel stay. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The audio recording showed that Kyle knowingly misrepresented personal expenses as business transactions. The bank records showed where the money went. Fiona's notebook showed when the events occurred. Together they formed a chain, one that would be difficult to break. Across Boston Harbor, Kyle Mercer was unaware of the recording's existence. He spent the afternoon in another strategy meeting at Northgate Dynamics. The conference room overlooked the harbor, and the large glass windows reflected the fading autumn sunlight. Kyle stood at the front of the room, delivering a presentation on regional expansion. Our logistics network is now operating at full capacity along the northeastern corridor, he said confidently. Several executives nodded. The company's growth had been impressive, and much of that growth was connected to Kyle's aggressive operational strategies. After the meeting ended, Vanessa approached him in the hallway. That went well, she said. Kyle smiled. It always does. Vanessa glanced around before speaking again. When are you finalizing the divorce? Soon, and the house? Kyle shrugged. Once everything's finalized legally, we'll make plans. Vanessa seemed satisfied with the answer, but something in Kyle's voice carried an edge of impatience. Divorce proceedings, financial disclosures, legal consultations, these were complications he preferred not to think about. From his perspective, the outcome was inevitable. He had already moved forward. Everything else was simply paperwork. That evening in Beacon Hill, Fiona returned home later than usual. Harold Caldwell was sitting in the study when she entered. You met Daniel today, he said. Fiona nodded. He received new evidence. Harold closed the book he had been reading. What kind? Fiona placed a small flash drive on the table. Audio. Harold raised an eyebrow. From Northgate's internal system. He inserted the flash drive into his computer and listened carefully. When the recording ended, the room remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Harold removed the drive. Kyle always believed confidence was protection, he said quietly. Fiona sat across from him. Daniel says the recording shows intent. Harold nodded slowly. It does. He leaned back in his chair. And intent matters to more than just divorce courts. Fiona understood the implication immediately. Corporate ethics policies were often strict about financial misrepresentation. Harold did not elaborate further. But the narrator understood something Fiona had not yet been told directly. Within the corporate structure of Northgate Dynamics, there were procedures for investigating financial misconduct, and once evidence like this reached the right level of oversight, it would not remain ignored. Not for long. Upstairs, Noah and Lily were already asleep. The house was quiet again. Fiona sat alone in the living room for a while after Harold returned to his study. She opened the notebook one more time. The pages were filled with months of observations, dates, messages, receipts. Tonight she added only a single new line. October 14th. Audio evidence confirmed. She closed the notebook gently. The narrator already knew what Fiona herself was beginning to understand. The story had reached a turning point. The evidence was no longer forming quietly in the background. It was ready, and soon, the truth Kyle Mercer had believed would remain hidden inside personal decisions was going to move into a space he could not control. A space where ambition, confidence, and carefully rehearsed explanations carried far less weight than documentation, and where the quiet woman he had once dismissed was now standing on ground far more solid than he had ever imagined. In large companies, power rarely revealed itself through loud announcements. It appeared in quieter ways. A change in the agenda of a board meeting, an unexpected request for documentation, or the sudden presence of someone who usually preferred to remain unseen. By the end of October, Northgate Dynamics was preparing for its quarterly board review. The meeting would take place in the company's main conference room, overlooking Boston Harbor. Senior executives had spent weeks preparing financial reports and strategic presentations. Kyle Mercer was confident. He had led the company's most aggressive expansion projects during the year, and the results were visible in every performance report. Revenue had increased. New contracts had been secured. Operational efficiency had improved. From Kyle's perspective, the board meeting would simply confirm what he already believed, that his leadership was pushing the company toward its next stage of growth. What he did not know was that another set of documents had already reached the board's attention. Quietly, through channels Kyle Mercer had never considered. That morning, the executive conference room filled slowly. Directors, legal advisors, and department heads took their seats around the long polished table. Large screens displayed financial graphs and operational summaries. Kyle stood near the presentation podium, reviewing his notes. Across the room, Vanessa Blake sat near the marketing team's section, scrolling through her tablet. Everything appeared normal, until the final board member entered. The door opened quietly. Several executives looked up automatically. And for the first time in Kyle Mercer's career at Northgate Dynamics, he saw Harold Caldwell walk into the room. Kyle blinked in confusion. He recognized Harold, of course, but only as Fiona's father, a retired investor, someone who rarely appeared in corporate environments. Yet Harold did not enter as a visitor. He walked calmly to the head of the table. One of the board members stood immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Others followed with respectful nods. Kyle felt a strange tightening in his chest. Vanessa looked up as well, clearly puzzled. Harold placed a folder on the table and sat down. "Let's begin," he said quietly. The CEO nodded. Of course. Kyle's presentation began shortly afterward. For the next 30 minutes, he delivered his strategic overview with the same confidence he always displayed. Charts appeared on the screen. Growth projections, operational forecasts, expansion plans. Several board members asked questions. Kyle answered smoothly. From the outside, everything seemed exactly as it had been in every previous board meeting. But Kyle noticed something unusual. Harold Caldwell was watching him closely. Not critically. Not even skeptically. Just attentively, as if evaluating something deeper than the numbers on the screen. When the presentation ended, the CEO thanked Kyle for his work. "Impressive results," he said. Kyle nodded modestly. Then Harold Caldwell spoke. "Mr. Mercer," he said calmly. Kyle turned toward him. "Yes, I'd like to review several financial items before we proceed to the next agenda point." Kyle felt the room shift slightly. "Of course," he replied. Harold opened the folder he had brought with him. Inside were printed documents, bank statements, expense reports, reimbursement approvals, the same records Daniel Brooks had already reviewed weeks earlier. Harold slid one page across the table. "Could you explain this reimbursement entry from June 17th? He asked. Kyle glanced down. Harborview Grill, client meeting. The amount seemed familiar. "A standard business dinner," Kyle said. With which client, Kyle hesitated briefly. "I'd need to check the records." Harold nodded. "Yes, that would be helpful." He slid another document forward. "And this weekend hotel reimbursement." Kyle looked at the page. "Boston Harbor Hotel, 2 nights, business conference." But Harold already knew something Kyle did not. The board had already reviewed the supporting documentation. "There appears to be some inconsistency," Harold continued. Kyle felt the temperature in the room shift again. "I'm sure accounting can clarify," he said carefully. Harold nodded once more. "Yes." Then he placed a small device on the table. "A recorder. Perhaps this will help clarify." The room fell silent. Harold pressed play. Kyle heard his own voice. "They don't need to know the details." Vanessa's voice followed. "Are you sure accounting won't ask questions?" Kyle's stomach tightened as the recording continued. "They won't. It's easier to file the dinners as client meetings." The audio ended. For several seconds no one spoke. Kyle felt the room closing in around him. Vanessa had gone completely still across the table. The CEO leaned forward slowly. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "do you wish to explain this recording?" Kyle opened his mouth, but the explanation he had once imagined offering suddenly felt far less convincing than it had before. Because the evidence was not speculation. It was his voice, his words. And the financial records were already sitting on the table. Harold Caldwell spoke again, his tone unchanged. "This company was built on financial discipline," he said. "Every executive here is trusted with that responsibility." Kyle looked toward him. Only now was he beginning to understand something he should have realized long ago. The man he had once dismissed as simply Fiona's father was not merely attending the meeting. He was the man the board had addressed first when entering the room. The man they had greeted with immediate respect. The man who had opened the meeting. Harold Caldwell closed the folder slowly. "I believe the board will need to review this matter formally," he said. The CEO nodded. "Yes." Kyle sat in silence. For the first time in years, he no longer felt certain about the future he had imagined so confidently. Because the structure of power he believed he understood had just revealed itself in a way he had never expected. And at the center of that structure sat the man whose daughter he had forced out of their home. The room remained quiet as the meeting moved to the next agenda item. But the truth had already entered the room. And it was not leaving with Kyle Mercer. The courtroom in downtown Boston was smaller than most people expected. Unlike the glass towers of corporate offices or the polished conference rooms of Northgate Dynamics, the family court building carried a quieter atmosphere. The walls were simple, the benches worn from years of use, and the air carried a sense of gravity that had nothing to do with status or ambition. Here, titles mattered less than facts. On a gray morning in early November, Fiona Caldwell arrived at the courthouse with Daniel Brooks walking beside her. She wore a simple navy coat and carried the same leather folder she had used during every meeting with Daniel. Inside were copies of the documents that had quietly reshaped the entire case: bank statements, expense reports, emails, and the audio recording. Daniel paused near the courtroom door. "You ready?" he asked gently. Fiona nodded. "I am." Across the hallway, Kyle Mercer stood with his own attorney. He looked tired. The events of the past 2 weeks had moved faster than he expected. The board of Northgate Dynamics had launched a formal internal review. Immediately after the meeting, Harold Caldwell had called. Kyle had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation proceeded. His corporate access had been temporarily suspended. For the first time since joining the company, he was no longer walking into the office each morning. The shift had been abrupt and unsettling. Vanessa Blake stood beside him in the hallway. But something about her presence had changed. She kept a slight distance now, as if unsure how close she should stand while others watched. Kyle noticed it, but said nothing. The bailiff opened the courtroom door. "Case Mercer versus Mercer," he announced. Everyone stepped inside. The judge entered shortly afterward. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for patience. Family court often required exactly that. Divorce proceedings were rarely simple. But this case had already attracted quiet attention among several legal professionals, not because of public scandal, but because of the unusual alignment of evidence. Daniel Brooks began calmly. Your Honor, this case concerns the dissolution of the marriage between Fiona Caldwell Mercer and Kyle Mercer. The judge nodded. Proceed. Daniel approached the table where several folders had already been prepared. We will present a clear timeline of financial and personal decisions made by Mr. Mercer over the past several months, he continued. Kyle's attorney shifted slightly in his seat, but he remained silent. Daniel opened the first folder. Exhibit A, he said. Bank statements from the shared Mercer account. He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. These records show repeated restaurant and hotel charges, corresponding with evenings Mr. Mercer represented to his wife as business obligations. Kyle looked down at the table. He already knew which documents Daniel was referring to. Daniel continued. Exhibit B. He held up another sheet. Corporate reimbursement reports from Northgate Dynamics. The judge reviewed the page carefully. These expenses, Daniel explained, were submitted by Mr. Mercer as business development meetings. The judge glanced up, and they were not. Daniel remained calm. Our next evidence addresses that directly. He nodded toward a small audio device placed on the evidence table. Exhibit C. Kyle felt the tension in his shoulders tighten. The recording played. The courtroom filled with the same conversation the board had already heard. They don't need to know the details. Vanessa's voice followed. Are you sure accounting won't ask questions? The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy. Daniel spoke again. This recording was obtained legally through discovery of corporate communications related to the expense reports. Kyle's attorney stood. Your Honor, we object to the implication that this recording alone determines intent. The judge nodded. Objection noted. She turned toward Daniel. Continue. Daniel stepped closer to the bench. Your Honor, our argument is not based on the recording alone. He gestured toward the folders on the table. It is supported by months of financial records and documented timelines. The judge studied Fiona briefly. You documented these timelines yourself. Fiona stood when Daniel nodded to her. Yes, Your Honor. How long have you been recording these observations? Approximately 6 months. And why did you begin? Fiona answered honestly. Because the pattern of my husband's behavior began to change. Her voice remained steady. I wanted to understand what was happening. The judge nodded. And did you confront him immediately? No. Why not? Fiona considered the question. I wanted to be certain before I accused anyone of anything. The courtroom remained quiet. The judge looked down at the evidence again. Then she turned toward Kyle. Mr. Mercer. Kyle stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Do you dispute that these expenses occurred? Kyle hesitated. No. And do you dispute the content of the recording? Kyle swallowed. No. The judge folded her hands. Then the court will consider these records as evidence of financial misconduct during the marriage. Kyle's attorney began speaking again, shifting the discussion toward custody arrangements and financial settlements. But the central narrative had already formed. The evidence spoke clearly, and unlike corporate boardrooms or private homes, a courtroom required explanations that matched the facts. Outside the courthouse later that afternoon, reporters were not waiting. The case had not drawn public attention. It remained a private, legal matter, but for those directly involved, the consequences were already unfolding. Kyle stood near the courthouse steps, while Vanessa spoke quietly on her phone. Her voice sounded tense. When she ended the call, she avoided his eyes. What is it? Kyle asked. Vanessa hesitated. The company contacted me, and they're asking questions. Kyle exhaled slowly. Of course they were. Corporate investigations rarely ended quietly once they began. Vanessa shifted uneasily. They want to review my communication records. Kyle looked at her. What did you tell them? Vanessa hesitated again. I told them the truth. Kyle felt something cold settle in his chest. The truth about that the expenses weren't business meetings. The space between them grew suddenly wider. For the first time since their relationship began, Vanessa looked uncertain, and Kyle finally understood something he should have realized much earlier. Ambition rarely stayed loyal when consequences appeared. That evening in Beacon Hill, Fiona returned home as Noah and Lily finished dinner with Harold Caldwell. The twins ran toward her happily. Grandpa let us use the telescope tonight, Lily said. Fiona smiled. That sounds exciting. Harold looked at her across the room. How did it go? Fiona removed her coat. The judge reviewed the evidence. Harold nodded, and the truth spoke for itself. Harold did not smile, but there was a quiet sense of closure in his expression, because the story that had begun with silence and observation was now unfolding exactly as it should. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through patience and the simple weight of documented truth. In the weeks following the court hearing, the quiet consequences of Kyle Mercer's decisions began to settle into every part of his life. At first, the changes appeared small, but small changes, when they accumulated, often reshaped everything. Kyle was still living in the Cambridge house, the same house where he had once told Fiona Caldwell to pack her things and leave. Yet the house no longer felt like the place he remembered. Vanessa Blake had stopped staying there regularly. At first she explained it as work pressure. Northgate Dynamics' internal investigation had expanded after the board meeting. Several executives, including Vanessa, had been asked to provide communication records and documentation related to corporate expense approvals. Her schedule, she said, had become unpredictable. Kyle knew the explanation was only partly true. The distance between them had begun the day the recording was played in the boardroom. Since then, Vanessa's confidence had slowly faded into caution. Ambition had brought her close to Kyle, but risk was beginning to push her away. The corporate investigation moved methodically. Northgate Dynamics had a strict governance structure, and financial irregularities involving senior executives required formal review. Within 2 weeks of the board meeting, Kyle received an official notice. Administrative leave was now extended. All corporate systems remained inaccessible. His role as director of operations was under review. The letter contained language that was professional and restrained, but the message was clear. The company was no longer treating the situation as a misunderstanding. They were examining it as misconduct. Kyle sat at the kitchen table, reading the letter for a long time. The room was silent. For the first time in years, his phone was not filled with incoming messages from colleagues or project teams. No strategy meetings, no contract negotiations, just waiting. Waiting had never been something Kyle handled well. 3 days later, the board of Northgate Dynamics held another private session. This meeting did not involve department heads or executive presentations. Only board members, legal counsel, and the chairman, Harold Caldwell. The boardroom overlooking Boston Harbor looked the same as it had during the earlier meeting, but the atmosphere had changed. The documents spread across the table were now more extensive. Financial reviews, internal communications, statements from accounting staff. Harold read through the final report slowly. The company's legal advisor spoke first. Our investigation confirms that several reimbursement submissions filed by Mr. Mercer were misrepresented as business expenses. A board member asked quietly, and Ms. Blake's involvement. The lawyer responded carefully. Ms. Blake acknowledged attending the dinners but stated she did not submit the expense forms herself. Harold closed the report. The responsibility lies with Mr. Mercer. No one disagreed. The board members understood that financial credibility formed the foundation of corporate leadership. If an executive could not maintain integrity in small transactions, the board could not trust that executive with larger decisions. The vote was unanimous. Kyle Mercer's employment with Northgate Dynamics would be terminated. Kyle received the call. Later that afternoon, the CEO's voice sounded measured. Kyle, the board has completed its review. Kyle already knew what was coming. We've decided to terminate your position effective immediately. There was a brief pause. This decision reflects the company's standards regarding financial accountability. Kyle listened without interrupting. The CEO continued, "You've contributed significantly to Northgate's growth, and that will be acknowledged in the official statement. But the board's decision is final." The call ended shortly afterward. Kyle remained seated at the kitchen table long after the phone went silent. For years, Northgate Dynamics had been the center of his professional identity. Now it was gone. Vanessa called him that evening. Her voice sounded cautious. "I heard about the board decision." Kyle nodded, though she could not see him. "Yes." Silence followed. Then Vanessa spoke again. "The investigation team wants another interview with me." Kyle leaned back in his chair. "About what they're reviewing internal communications." Kyle understood immediately. Emails, messages, anything that might connect her more directly to the expense reports. "What are you going to say?" he asked. Vanessa hesitated. "The truth." Kyle felt the weight of the answer. "And what does that mean for us?" Vanessa paused longer this time. "I think we both need time to focus on our own situations." Kyle closed his eyes briefly. "Vanessa, I'm sorry," she said softly. Then the call ended. The house fell silent again. Kyle sat alone in the kitchen. The future he had imagined so clearly months earlier had begun to dissolve piece by piece. First the marriage, then the investigation, now the career, and finally the relationship that had seemed so certain. The narrator understood something Kyle Mercer was only beginning to realize. Confidence had once made him believe every decision was moving him forward. But decisions rarely moved in only one direction. Sometimes they circled back. Across the city in Beacon Hill, life inside Harold Caldwell's townhouse remained steady. The twins had just finished dinner. Noah sat on the floor, assembling a model rocket kit Harold had bought him. Lily was drawing constellations she had seen through the telescope the night before. Fiona watched them quietly from the couch. The legal proceedings had reached their final stage. Daniel Brooks had informed her earlier that afternoon that the divorce settlement was nearly complete. Custody arrangements, financial support, property division. The process had been handled calmly without unnecessary conflict. Harold entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Daniel called?" he asked. "Yes," and Fiona accepted the cup. "The settlement will be finalized this week." Harold nodded slowly. "And the children, they'll remain with me." Harold glanced toward Noah and Lily. "That's good." Fiona sat quietly for a moment. "Kyle lost his position today," she said. Harold did not appear surprised. Corporate boards tend to act quickly once the facts are clear. Fiona looked down at her tea. "I didn't want that outcome." Harold studied her carefully. "But you also didn't create it." Fiona nodded. The distinction mattered. She had never sought revenge, only truth and stability for her children. Outside the Beacon Hill townhouse, the evening lights of Boston flickered across the quiet street. The story that had begun months earlier with small observations in a notebook was approaching its final chapter. Not with anger, not with celebration, but with something quieter. The quiet recognition that truth, when allowed to unfold patiently, often carried consequences far greater than any confrontation ever could. Winter arrived slowly in Boston. By early December, the narrow streets of Beacon Hill were lined with thin layers of frost in the mornings, and the city carried the quiet stillness that often followed the first cold winds of the season. Inside Harold Caldwell's townhouse, life had settled into a new rhythm. For Noah and Lily, the changes that had once felt confusing now felt normal. They woke each morning in the same bedroom upstairs, ate breakfast at the same kitchen table, and walked to school with their grandfather along the same brick sidewalks. Children, the narrator understood, often adjusted more quickly than adults expected. What mattered most to them was consistency, and consistency had returned. The legal proceedings between Fiona Caldwell and Kyle Mercer reached their final stage on a gray afternoon in family court. The courtroom looked exactly as it had during the earlier hearings. Plain wooden benches, quiet walls, a judge who had seen hundreds of cases pass through the same room. Daniel Brooks sat beside Fiona as the final documents were reviewed. The settlement had been negotiated carefully over several weeks. Kyle Mercer had agreed to the terms. Primary custody of Noah and Lily would remain with Fiona. Kyle would have scheduled visitation rights. Financial support would be provided according to state guidelines. The Cambridge house would be sold. Neither party spoke much during the hearing. There was little left to argue. The facts had already shaped the outcome. When the judge finished reviewing the documents, she looked at both of them. This court recognizes that the dissolution of a marriage affects more than two individuals, she said. It affects families, children, future stability. Her eyes moved briefly toward Fiona. The evidence presented in this case demonstrated patience and careful documentation. Then she looked at Kyle, and it demonstrated the consequences of financial and personal decisions made without transparency. The judge signed the final order. "The divorce is granted." Her voice remained calm. "You are both free to move forward." The gavel struck lightly. Just like that, a chapter of 15 years was over. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung low with winter clouds. Kyle stood on the steps for several minutes after the hearing ended. His lawyer had already left. Most of the people in the courthouse had moved on to other cases. He watched as Fiona walked toward the street, with Daniel Brooks beside her. Noah and Lily were not there. Harold had kept them home from school that afternoon, to avoid the courthouse entirely. Kyle appreciated that decision, even if no one had asked for his opinion. For a moment he considered calling out Fiona's name. But the words did not come, because there was nothing left to argue, and nothing left to defend. Fiona paused briefly at the curb as Daniel spoke to her. Then she nodded, shook his hand, and walked toward the waiting car. She did not look back. Kyle remained where he was until the car disappeared into the traffic of downtown Boston. The narrator understood something Kyle Mercer was only beginning to accept. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They appear gradually, like winter settling over a city. Quiet, unavoidable. A week later, Fiona closed the final legal folder on the dining table in Beacon Hill. The paperwork was complete. The marriage had ended. The legal process was finished. For the first time in months, there were no new documents to review, no timelines to verify, no evidence left to organize. Harold entered the room, carrying a small box. "What's that?" Fiona asked. "Something for you," he said. She opened the box. Inside was a new notebook, leather-bound, simple. Fiona smiled faintly. "I thought I was finished with these." Harold sat down across from her. "Perhaps. But records are not always about conflict. Sometimes they are about remembering." Fiona ran her fingers across the cover. For a moment, she thought about the notebook that had carried her through the most difficult months of her life. The pages filled with quiet observations, dates, messages, receipts, evidence. She stood, walked to the bookshelf and placed the old notebook inside a drawer. Not hidden, just finished. When she returned to the table, Harold was watching her thoughtfully. "You handled this with remarkable restraint," he said. Fiona shook her head gently. "I handled it the only way I knew how." Harold smiled slightly, which is often the best way. That evening, the twins burst into the living room, carrying a large paper star they had made at school. Mom Lily said excitedly, "We're decorating the window." Noah carefully unfolded the paper edges. "It's for the winter festival." Fiona knelt beside them. "Let's hang it here," she said. They worked together for several minutes, adjusting the string until the star caught the light from the window. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. The flakes moved quietly through the air, covering the street in soft white. For the twins, the moment was simple. For Fiona, it felt like something deeper. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. The story that had begun with suspicion, quiet observation, and months of patience had ended exactly the way she needed it to, with stability, with dignity, and with the quiet certainty that she had protected what mattered most. Across the city, Kyle Mercer was beginning a very different winter. One without the career he once believed defined him. One without the certainty he once carried so easily. But that part of the story belonged to him now. Fiona closed the curtains gently as the snow continued to fall outside. And, for the first time in a long while, there was nothing left she needed to write down. The story you've just heard is not about revenge. It's about patience, about the quiet strength it takes to observe, instead of shouting, to document, instead of reacting, and to trust that truth, when given enough time, has a way of revealing itself. Fiona Caldwell never tried to destroy anyone. She simply refused to abandon her dignity. And in the end, that quiet dignity carried more weight than anger ever could. If this story stayed with you for a moment, you might take a second to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Stories like this travel far, and it's always remarkable to see how many places they reach. And if you believe stories about patience, justice, and quiet strength deserve a place here, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.